G'day, welcome to part 6 of my unpacking of Richard Flanagan's book Toxic. This could be a long one, but I will later break it down into a series of snapshots. If you're pressed for time, I really encourage you to view the bite-sized snapshot series, which are also on my channel. Today's theme is hypocrisy, wrapped up in a bit more hyperbole to create an atmosphere of hysteria. But let's start with a quick dismissal of some of the lies in this chapter. On page 123, Flanagan writes, "In 2007, Armitage sold the lease to Spring Bay Seafoods. They used it to farm mussels, but when the site proved too warm even for the hardy shellfish, which died en masse, Spring Bay Seafoods rented the lease to Tassal. Well, that's incorrect. The mussels didn't die. They in fact thrived. Unfortunately, they thrived on eating toxic microalgae, most likely introduced in ballast water from woodchip ships. The algae is not toxic to the mussels, but if we eat the mussels, could cause toxic shellfish paralysis. That made the mussel farm unviable and therefore was converted to a salmon farm, because salmon don't eat microalgae, so there's no risk to us." People have asked why no one has sued Flanagan. Well, on page 126, the publishers at least thought that someone might. In Australia, Australian companies which employ more than 10 people cannot sue for defamation. Flanagan has been very clever about this, only defaming the salmon companies and not individual people, knowing that the companies cannot sue. Looks like he almost slipped up here. And here's the first example of our theme today: hypocrisy. Flanagan talks of people who liked anti-salmon farming Facebook posts being intimidated. Well, I've been blocked from pretty much every anti-salmon farming Facebook group there is. Thanks John Stansfield from Southeast Marine Protection for at least allowing a two-sided debate. And people have posted these videos of mine on the TAMP Facebook page, have been blocked and the video links deleted. Only the other day, when viewing Richard's webinar hosted by the Australia Institute, after I'd made 3 factual comments, I was hounded, abused, my family history googled and posted and commented on in the chat. Ironically, the moderator asked Richard if he'd ever faced any intimidation since releasing his book. No, he replied, unaware of what his hypocritical, unquestioning followers were quite happily doing to me. As to the supposed intimidation of public servants he mentions on page 127 and 128, I suggest that Richard read the documents obtained by Environment Tasmania under the Freedom of Information, where Dipipwi wildlife staff interrogate Tassal employees about holding seals in an empty sea cage, which, while technically illegal, but where the company was actually trapped in a regulatory catch-22. Those Dipipwi wildlife inspectors were anything but intimidated. In fact, reading the transcripts, they were pretty bloody intimidating. But let's get to the theme of today: hypocrisy. Featured on the Four Corners 2016 Big Fish episode, and revived by Flanagan in this book 5 years later, as if he hadn't actually heard the story before, is the story of the proprietors of Dover Bay Mussels, who I must admit I used to enjoy a drink with at the local sailing club. Dover Bay Mussels alleged that their operations and their business failed due to the actions of Tassal. For this, we need to go back in time. About 20 years ago, I was given the role of managing the operation of a small mussel lease here on Port Esperance, off Pottery Beach. You can just see the remaining mussel buoys in the distance behind us. It wasn't a particularly productive lease. Our growth rates were unpredictable. Some years they'd be great, some years there wouldn't be much at all. We'd get nutrient flows down the Esperance River, which were great, but one thing we did have was that our mussel lines were always covered with an orange tourniquet slime. And remember, we're talking here 21 years ago. This shed behind us was once the processing facility for Dover Bay mussels. On the far shore, about 500 metres west of Tassal's Meads Creek lease, which you can see in the distance, was the mussel farming lease operated by Dover Bay Mussels. This is the New Zealand mussel harvesting technique, where the long lines are mechanically lifted, the fouling stripped off, the mussels removed, and the fouling then deposited back into the lease. This is the system that Dover Bay Mussels used. So for the operators of Dover mussels to claim that the tourniquet fouling and other contamination of their mussels was due to pressure washing of the salmon farm nets by Tassal 500 metres away, when that orange tourniquet slime was already in the bay 20 years prior, and when Dover Mussels' own operation involved stripping the biofouling off their lines and dumping it back into their own lease, well, one might say that's shitting in your own nest. And in the very case, it's drawing a very long bow to blame that upon salmon farming. But it's not just shitting in your own nest. It smacks of hypocrisy to me. Flanagan's major thesis in his book Toxic is that the solution to all the problems he sees exist with the Tasmanian salmon industry is to move the industry onto land. Notwithstanding the hypocrisy in Chapter 2, where he incorrectly attacked land-based salmon farming for supposedly contaminating Hobart's drinking water supply, in Chapter 6 too, he continues his attack on his proposed land-based saviour to the salmon farming problem. In 2019, Tassal lodged a development application to build a land-based, closed-loop, recirculating aquaculture system hatchery, similar to this in size to this one behind me, on land between Hamilton and Ouse in Tasmania's Central Highlands. Recirculating aquaculture systems recycle 99% of the water, and Tassal proposed to use the discarded 1% after it had been through biofiltration, denitrification, ultraviolet and ozone sterilisation as irrigation water on surrounding pasture. Irrigating pasture with the water from recirculating aquaculture systems is a model that Huon Aquaculture have done for some years here at their Forest Home hatchery, irrigating the pastures you can see in the distance, upon which are being grazed by cattle belonging to the Bruny Island Cheese Company. In fact, those very pastures, including this irrigation runoff water, have just been certified as organic. But then the NIMBYs came out of the woodwork and the hypocrisy was overflowing. We're just outside Hamilton in Tasmania's Central Highlands, and this is the location of Tassal's proposed Meadowbank hatchery. This is some of the most devastated agricultural land in Tasmania, suffering from deforestation, and in summer it's a dust bowl and a drought area. You can see from the top of the hills behind how the topsoil has already eroded away. And the reason it's green is because of irrigation, and you can see one of the iRig units behind us. Yet the neighbouring farmer believes that irrigation from the Tassal hatchery is going to contaminate his drinking water when he's irrigating his own land already, and the natural runoff from his combined sheep and cattle farm could be as much as 25 to 30 kilograms of nitrate per hectare. Smacks of hypocrisy to me. So this is a map of the location for Tassal's proposed Meadowbank hatchery at Hamilton, and approximately here is where that last scene was shot. You can see the proposed site of the hatchery here, the dam for the irrigation water, and the areas that are to be irrigated. Noting that yesterday we saw an irrigator already operating in this area. So let's examine the science that Richard Flanagan cites in this chapter, specifically around the effect on the drinking water from Meadowbank Lake and the nitrate poisoning that he alleges. So he cites in this chapter some scientific articles. The first one he cites is this, and he says that this article says crop production uses and potentially overuses fertiliser nutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, and these fertilisers can degrade the quality of surface and groundwater used by humans. So there's no debate that over-fertilising can impact on water. He then cites this specific example here, that the development of this condition, blue baby syndrome, reducing the oxygen capacity of an infant's blood, is from people who rely on private well water and drink high levels of nitrate. Well, in fact, we get the same problem with our fish because it's the nitrate converting back to nitrite that's the problem, and we call this nitrite poisoning brown blood disease. But it's interesting that in this article that he cites, the article is 14 pages long, and this is the only mention of nitrate in it. Because the article he cites to demonstrate the impact of nitrate poisoning from fish irrigation onto crops is actually an article about the impact of feeding crops to fish. And in those 14 pages, he's cherry-picked one paragraph to provide his scientific evidence. But let's unpack it a bit further, because he also cites this one here: the prenatal nitrate intake from drinking water and selected birth defects. So, alleging that high levels of nitrate can cause birth defects in young children. Well, the paper here that he cites actually concludes, the study findings suggested that endogenous formation of nitrous compounds might not be the underlying mechanism for potential tetragenesis. Now, I don't exactly know what that means, but what it actually concludes is the high level of nitrate from drinking water did not strengthen associations between prenatal exposure to these drugs, which also have nitrate in them. And so, given that nitrate contamination occurs in conjunction with other water contaminants, future studies of birth defects might focus on prenatal exposure to mixtures of contaminants in drinking water. In essence, the authors of this article are saying the jury's out. There's a correlation, but there is enough of a correlation against to suggest that the effects might be caused by other things. But let's take it on board that nitrate does cause birth defects. So how much nitrate is in the drinking water, and where do we get our nitrate from? Okay, so further up the article here, it says, in the population, median contributions of food and drinking water nitrate to daily intake of nitrate were 94% and 6%. So 94% of the nitrate intake for these babies that had birth defects came from the food that they ate, while only 6% came from the water that they drank. But nevertheless, let's look at the nitrate levels in that water and see how much we're talking about. So they measured three sources: bottled water, public water supplies, and private wells. And the median levels, the average levels of nitrate in milligrams per litre for bottled water was 0.33. For public water, tap water, it was 5. And for private wells, it was 17.6. Okay, so there's our baseline. So let's now examine how much nitrate is actually in recirculating aquaculture systems water. And we'll find from this article here, it says, in some systems with low water flow rate, so that's the slowest and least efficient operating recirculating aquaculture systems, the parameter of nitrate has become increasingly important, and its concentration levels should be lower than 10 milligrams per litre. So, even if you drank the water directly from Tassale's recirculating hatchery at Hamilton, regardless of whether there's runoff into the lake, even if you drank from the tanks, you'd be taking in 10 milligrams per litre compared to the 17 milligrams per litre from well water. So you really have to drink twice as much of that salmon water to actually get to near that level that people are getting from their regular water supply. So let's go back and look at the actual content of the irrigation water. Now, this is from the environmental impact statement for the Hamilton hatchery, and this is the water that is going to be put onto the pasture from the previous picture. And it says here that the nutrients applied are 92 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. Now, that's total nitrogen, so when you break that down lower for nitrate. The animals that eat the grass consume and take on 30 kilograms per hectare of that. The soil itself breaks down 46 kilograms per hectare. So in a total, 76 kilograms per hectare are broken down in the environment, leaving a total of 16 kilograms per hectare to potentially run off into the drinking water. But the people who have complained about this are the people who operate this farm here. And what do they run on this farm? Well, it's a combined sheep and cattle farm. And the surface runoff from sheep and cattle farms is shown from this research to be 37 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for cattle and 26 kilograms for sheep. So approximately 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare is already running off those people's property into the lake, and they are complaining about 16 kilograms from the fish hatchery. That smacks of hypocrisy to me. But in conclusion, let's examine what our Australian drinking water standards are and see whether our water is safe to drink. Here's the drinking water guidelines for nitrate and nitrate. Based on health considerations, the guideline value of 50 milligrams per litre has been set to protect bottle-fed infants under 3 months of age. Up to 100 milligrams of nitrate per litre can be safely consumed by adults and children over 3 months of age. And the typical Australian drinking water contains less than 0.15 milligrams per litre. So this is not just hypocrisy. This is hyperbole, a gross exaggeration, and all it does is creates hysteria. This is the lower end of Lake Meadowbank, which continues around the corner in the distance. It's actually part of the Derwent River, dammed for drinking water and for a small power station. This is also the lake where the local farmers draw their water for irrigation and where the runoff from that irrigation runs into the lake. It's also the lake from where they draw their drinking water, and it's also the lake where Tassale's irrigation will allegedly run off. What's not widely known about this lake is that it's possibly the home to the greatest number of Atlantic salmon swimming outside a marine cage, because this lake is regularly stocked by inland fisheries and others with Atlantic salmon, rainbow trout and brown trout, all introduced salmonid species for the recreational trout fishery. So for those farmers to complain about the potential contamination from salmon from the hatchery when they're already drawing their drinking water from a lake which is full of salmonids smacks to me of hypocrisy. So here they are, Atlantic salmon, rainbow trout and brown trout. And if we note down here, are they regarded as pest fish? Doesn't look like it. But having said that, they are very protective of the water in this lake. And that brings us close to the end of this episode. In chapter 2, we saw the lies about mercury poisoning. In chapter 3, we saw the catastrophisation about the proven safe use of ethoxyquin and antibiotics. In chapter 4, we saw the deceptive use of hyperbole. In chapter 5, we saw the exaggeration where the complaints of one person and one tiny community group of shack owners gives the impression that everyone is complaining about noise from salmon farms. And here, in chapter 6, we have the hypocrisy of people who, while already shitting in their own nests, complain that it's actually somebody else's shit. To be fair, both of those complainants have agreed to stop complaining. Richard Flanagan says it's because they've been paid off. Even if that is the case, if I was constantly shooting my mouth off and making myself look foolish, and someone paid me to stop, I'd take the money too. Anyone? But finally, the biggest hypocrisy is Flanagan's own argument that he wants salmon farms moved onto land. Even if this was environmentally sustainable in terms of electricity use, land use, animal welfare, water and waste disposal, or economically sustainable in terms of cost return and geographical location, would it ever be socially sustainable in the minds of Flanagan and his fellow salmon farming opponents, let alone land-based environmental activists? I seriously doubt it. And that is the ultimate hypocrisy. They say they want to improve salmon farming, when in their minds the only way to improve it is to stop it. Smacks of hypocrisy to me.